Hi everyone, welcome back to the Audit and Attestation class, chapter 4. We are continuing with it. So in this chapter, in this session, we'll be covering the topic general procedure to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. And this is part 1. There is part 2 and part 3 also coming after this. In this part 1, we'll be covering general audit procedure, integrated audit, test of control, and the factors to determine the extent of test of control. So let's dive into part 1.
Okay, so we are starting with general procedure to obtain the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. What are the general procedure? Inquiry, inspection, observation, reperformance, recalculation, like, and the confirmation. So these are general procedure, whether we are performing like walkthrough, we are doing test of control, or whether we are doing analytical procedure, or whether we are doing test of detail. Generally, we do like these 5 kind of procedure, right? First one is inquiry. Like in the morning also we discuss about the inquiry. Inquiry may be with the management. Inquiry may be with those charged with governance. Inquiry may be with internal auditor. Inquiry may be you can say specialist. That can be internal specialist or external specialist. Who all are specialists? Who is specialist? Hope you remember this.
Sir, actually, like anybody who's giving us the, for whom we are leveraging their specialized knowledge,
Like
support our audit, actuarials and all those.
So those who are expert in that particular field.
Those who are expert in particular field other than
Auditors.
Accounting and audit, right? Because
Yes,
those area CPA is considered to be an
expert,
right? Employee or any other member. So you can do inquiry with management, you can perform inquiry with those charged with governance, internal auditors, specialists, or to the employees, which may be like you can say middle level employee, or you can say top level management, head of the department. All these things come under the inquiry procedure. When do you perform inquiry procedure? When do you perform inquiry procedure in an audit?
Throughout the audit, ideally.
Throughout the audit.
Yeah, throughout the audit, right? You may do inquiry at the planning stage, right? When you perform like walkthroughs, then also you do inquiry when you perform test of controls, or when you're performing analytical procedure or test of detail. In all stage, you perform the inquiry procedure. It's not necessary to be at planning stage only, right? Inspection. What is inspection? Inspection of records or document, like those records or document that consist for examination purpose, which you examine for the respective financial statement line item. It can be internal document, it can be external document, it can be in paper form, it can be in electronic form, or it can be in video, or it can be in any other media format, right? And inspection include inspection of tangible aspects as well, which include like inventory or fixed assets, right? So those kind of procedure, like for example, we discuss in the morning about purchase and payable process. What all document you will be inspecting? Purchase requisition, purchase order, good receipt note, invoice, right? And then payment supporting and everything, right? So those documents which are internally generated or externally received in the process is called document for the inspection. You'll be performing inspection procedure in verifying those documents to understand and evaluate the respective transaction, class of transaction, account balance, and disclosure, right? So inspection is more critical step in an audit. Like especially in audit, only the inquiry is not sufficient to conclude any audit or examination, right? You mandatorily need to perform inspection procedure, observation procedure, reperformance, recalculation, confirmation, or mix of any of these procedures. So audit, you cannot conclude just based on inquiry. That's important thing you all need to understand. Observation. Observation would be when management is performing certain thing, you'll be observing. It can be inventory count, it can be cash count, it can be PP&E count, it can be other process. Especially like we have discussed in the morning, an example of when your IT team is testing the IT general controls or application control. They observe how initiation, recording, processing, and reporting of the transaction take place into the system, right? That is also comes under the observation procedure. Fourth one is reperformance or recalculation. What is reperformance? Any idea?
There's any calculation has been done, so we tend to reperform it using the formulas and all the supporting evidences. So we perform a recalculation of that particular thing, which is which comes under reperformance. Yeah.
Yeah.
But reperformance primarily is when, let's say, an internal auditor has performed something and we are reperforming the same control by following the same process to make sure the desired result
Yes.
is accurate.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely right. I think.
So is it the thing that when we review the client's prepared work, like when we are at review work,
no, it can be both.
engagements?
It can be for both. It can be client work or it can be internal auditor work if you are planning to rely. So you might be doing reperformance. One is like the example I think Ayush has given is for recalculation, like depreciation calculation, payroll calculation, provisions calculation. So you might be doing recalculation, what management has done to gain the comfort over the overall mathematical accuracy. So that is a recalculation. Reperformance is majorly relating to the controls, right? So some of the control testing, if you are planning to rely on internal auditor, so we might be doing like 20% to 30% reperformance of what the work internal auditor has done, right? Sometime we'll be doing reperformance of the work done by the management. For example, like when you are doing IT general control testing or application control testing. So one transaction you may observe how management is doing, and one transaction you can do reperform on the behalf of management to further evaluate and understand how the results are coming from those reperformance. Is it matching with your expectation or not? So this can be an example for the reperformance. But generally reperformance and recalculation is considered as a one group of activity. Right? Make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Last one is confirmation. Confirmation where third party like lawyer, customer, banker, lender, whom you send the confirmation and request them to send it back directly to you, not to the customer. So those comes in the confirmation procedure, and confirmation are most reliable source because it is coming independently from third party, right? So these are general audit procedure in an audit, right, at all stage. So now look at integrated audit. What is integrated audit? In which you are doing audit of financial statement as well as
Internal
control over the financial reporting, right? So for issuer, it's mandatory, and for non-issuer, it is optional, right? In an integrated audit, auditor should plan to test control to accomplish the objective of both audit of financial statement. Oh my God, it's raining. Here also it started raining. Yeah. In an integrated audit, like auditor should plan to test control as well as the test of detail to accomplish the objective of audit of both financial statement as well as internal control. So to obtain a sufficient audit evidence to support the auditor opinion on internal control over the financial reporting and to support the auditor control risk assessment for the purpose of audit of financial statement. So here, have you heard about dual purpose audit sampling?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
Any idea what is dual purpose audit sample?
So when we use the same sample for our test of control and the same sample for test of business.
Yes, absolutely true. So when you are using the same sample for test of control to test the attribute. We'll be coming to that. What is attribute testing? In test of control, we do not test the value. We test the attributes. So we'll come in detail for that, what exactly we are testing in controls. And in test of detail, we test the value. So same sample you can select and use for testing the attribute for the controls. And to those same sample we can use as for the test of detail as well for testing the value. But generally the sample size should be bigger than the anyone. So when you are doing your dual purpose testing, your normal sample size, if say 50 is for test of control and let's say 30 is for test of detail, in total it is 30 plus 50, 80. But here it can be 60. It can be less than the total combined sample, but will be more than the individual sample. Right? When planning and performing an audit of internal control over financial reporting, the auditor should evaluate whether control sufficiently address the risk of material misstatement due to fraud or error, and controls are intended to address the risk of material management overriding of control, right? So here, whenever you are planning to test the controls, two things you need to keep in mind. Are the controls sufficient to address the risk of material misstatement or fraud risk, right? Or the control are intended to address the risk of management overriding, right? Such control would include first, significant unusual transaction, particularly late or unusual journal entry. So what are the controls management has in place for the significant journal entries, unusual journal entries, or journal entries which are generally being put it in the last day of the year, or you can say at the last moment of the year. Journal entry made extremely at the end of the year, journal entry relating to related party transaction, journal entry relating to significant estimates, or mitigating incentives for and pressure of the management to satisfy the management result. So what are the controls that management has in place to mitigate the risk of these items and to mitigate the risk of management overriding of control? So those things you need to keep in mind whenever you are planning your test of details and test of controls, right? Test of controls are being done with the objective to evaluate two things. One is designing effectiveness of internal control, and the second is operating effectiveness of the internal control, right? Things we evaluate in test of control is attribute testing. So in test of control, whenever we do, we test the control, we do not test the value. And testing of control is called testing of attribute. That means whether the transaction is being authorized or not, whether the transaction is being authorized by the authorized person or different person, right? Whether that person who has authorized respective payment as per authorization metrics, does he have authority to make that much amount payment approval, right? Those kind of attributes actually we test in test of control. We do not test the value in test of control. Make sense? The difference between testing of control and testing of detail is majorly testing of attribute and testing of value, right? What we test in test of control? Are you guys with me? What do we test in test of control? Attribute or value?
Attributes.
What is an attribute?
So basically check a characteristic. So basically authority. So the points are listed first and second.
Yeah. Like segregation of duty, like authority of the individuals, right? Authorization metrics, right? System controls, makers and checkers. So those things come under the testing of control. If you see the first point, authority and competency of the control owner. Authority means as per authorization matrix, does that person is authorized to pass the respective transaction or approve the respective transaction, right? So as per the segregation of duty, like whether any person who is being involved in purchase activity, does he passing or approving any sales related activity or treasury related activity, right? Testing of those things is authority, testing of authority. What is competency of the control owner?
Competency is primarily related to how competent, whether they are qualified, whether they have the relevant experience, skill set.
Education and experience, right? If someone is being authorized to approve, let's say $50,000 or $100,000 payments, does he understand what payments he or she is approving? Does he has that capability to apply the logical mindset, or does he or she has kept competency to look at the respective you can say documents and evaluate whether the transaction are legitimate or not, right? That is the reason at each level we test the authority and competency of the control owner. That is very important. If the control owner is not competent, then the control is not operating effectively, right? If the control owner is not authorized but he is doing the transaction, then also control is not operating effectively. Make sense? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Second is, does the control satisfy the company's control objective? So what is the company's control objective? Generally is to prevent and protect their assets, right? Is to timely identify or mitigate the respective requirement so that company loss should be minimized, right? Does the control effectively prevent or detect the error or fraud that could result in a material misstatement in financial statement? So you need to evaluate whether those respective controls are meeting the control objectives or not. If the controls are not meeting their objective, that means it's a design deficiency, right? Make sense? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
management lack of competency may have more persuasive impact on financial statement and may require the overall response by the auditor. If, for example, you have appointed a controller who is not a CPA and does not have accounting background, he is from sales. He might not understand the debit and credit well. He might not understand costing concept well. He might not understand pricing concept well, right? If such kind of person you have appointed as a finance controller, that means as an auditor, we need to evaluate the possible risk in the respective financial statement line item, and accordingly we need to plan and perform additional audit procedure to mitigate those risks. And this is a risk at the persuasive nature, because like finance controller is generally responsible for the review of the overall financial statement line item, as well as like you can say review of key estimates, key judgments, right? So here the impact would be persuasive if that person is not competent for the respective job.
So it's written pervasive. So is it pervasive or persuasive?
Persuasive.
Okay.
Thank you. Next is test of control procedure include mix of inquiry, observation, and inspection. Confirmation is always test of detail, right? Recalculation and reperformance is most of the time test of detail. In test of control, you majorly perform inquiry procedure and inspection procedure and sometime observation procedure, right? Inquiry standalone is not sufficient. An auditor uses a combination of the procedure. So for test of control, if you're just doing inquiry, that is not sufficient. You have to do inspection or observation or mix of inspection, observation, and inquiry procedure, right? You will see multiple choice question where They may ask you like management has or auditor has done the inquiry. Would it be sufficient for test of control purpose? The answer would be no, right? There should be a mix of procedure to gain the comfort over the operating effectiveness of the internal control. You cannot say just by performing the inquiry with the management, you will gain the comfort over the operating effectiveness of the internal control. It's mandatory to perform either inspection or observation or combination of both.
So this is a thumb rule that only three of these procedure would be there, or like, because I've come across controls where we reperform, maybe for IP purpose.
Yes, yeah. You can
so
say,
so if okay,
you can add reperformance.
So when we are reperforming, then it will come under test of details, no?
No, like when we're doing IT general control testing, that time we do reperformance.
Okay, that will also come under test of control.
So that is majorly for IT application control, IT general controls, or when we are doing like relying on internal auditor. So we are doing reperformance of their work.
So we can recalculation also be added here?
No, recalculation is for numbers, and numbers are being tested in test of details. For test of control, we are testing attributes.
Okay.
So next one is factor to determine the extent of control testing. So how do you determine the number of samples? That is generally based on the frequency of the performance of control during the period, right? So frequency, how the frequency has been determined for the audit perspective. Like if some control is performed annually, like inventory count or physical count of PP&E, so that like management do once in a year. So the controls which management perform once in a year is called annual controls, right? So controls which management perform twice in a year, that is called semi-annual control. It can be like cash count, it can be review of unaudited balance sheet, right? So some controls that management perform quarterly are called quarterly control. The frequency is 4 times in a year, which can be like quarterly review of financial reserve. It can be quarterly review of provisions. It can be quarterly review of estimates, right? So those controls are called quarterly controls. Next is monthly control. There are so many control. Most of the company do monthly basis. Have you heard about month-end closing process?
Yes, I was going to say month-end checklist.
How many of you have ever involved in month-end closing process?
So reviewed a few controls like, the month-end checklist or the quarter-end checklist kind of wherein whether the entries were posted or whatever.
For example.
So whether all the revenue transactions have been recorded for the period, any top side adjustment that needs to be posted during the period, intercompany transactions, prepaids, whether the, and then there is a proper cycle that, okay, what do you call it, like T+5 and T+2, like, +2 minus 2, what days they need to do what activity. And accordingly, they by when they have to close their monthly books and quarterly books and all.
Yeah, sure. So Ayush, Nimisha, Rasi, any idea? Monthly controls? Gurmehar, you want to share some examples?
So one example what I feel can be from tax point of view can be at the end of the month we reconcile the taxation balances as well, all the payables and receivable balance. And we put an adjustment entry if there is any to reconcile it with the filed statements and everything, and that also comes under the closing process.
Yeah, so like sub-ledger and general ledger reconciliation, bank reconciliation, AR aging, AP aging, right? Depreciation calculation, right? So those all generally comes under month-end activities, and someone is preparing those activity and someone is reviewing. So those controls which like management do monthly is called monthly control, and frequency is 12 times in a year, right? There are certain controls which is weekly as well. In US, like most of the company pay bi-weekly payroll. So some company pay weekly and some company pay bi-weekly, right? So in there, like when every week they are doing payroll calculation and making the payments to the respective employee. So that can be called as a weekly control. So which is the control frequency is more than 12 times, but less than 52 times is called weekly control. Daily controls, when any controls are happening more than 52 times in a year, but less than 250 times. So that can be like other expenses, like travel expense, hotel, lodging, boarding expense, internet, rent, telephone, those kind of expenditure, right? It comes under the daily frequency. And any control which is happening more than 250 times in a year is called multiple times a day. So these all are audit terminology. Basically, you need to understand like what is daily control and what is multiple time a day. So any control activity which is happening more than 250 times in a year, generally like sales transaction, purchase transaction, they happen like 2, 3, 5 or 10 or 100 times in a day, right? If you look at like Amazon, there's like billion of transaction happening every year. So those comes under the category of multiple times a day. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
So how many times the frequency? Yeah, please.
So one query. So like, is this any standard guidelines for these? Like which should be the annual frequency and which test of control should be semi-annual? Or it is based by the company itself?
This is what I mentioned here. These are the guidelines. If any controls is happening once in a year, it's called annual control. Twice in a year, semi-annual. 4 times in a year, quarterly. More than 4 times but less than 12 times, monthly. More than 12 times, less than
that I got, so that I got, but just like the examples that you have shared, so these are only for our illustrative. Like for inventory, it can be annual and it can be semi-annual as well.
Yeah, these all are illustrative examples. Yes,
Okay.
you need to figure
there
out.
Is no guideline for those processes.
No,
that company it sets itself.
Yeah, so maybe they can do monthly cash count. That might be possible, right? Then it comes in a monthly control rather than semi-annual, which we mentioned here. You need to figure out based on the process that management do have.
So this will be presented in company's policy, which
yes,
we will.
Yes.
And so what would be the control around this daily frequency which is happening daily, like it's happening 250 times a year, other expenses and all. We will be checking authorization controls and all.
No, we'll come to that. As of now, we are discussing what are the factors which impacting how much number of sample you need to test.
Okay.
Right. So if you have annual control, you might be testing 1 sample. You cannot test more than that, right? If it is semi-annual 2, you can test 1 out of 2. Quarterly, you can test 2 out of 4, right? Monthly, 3 to 5 based on the risk, right? Same way, weekly, 5 to 10 based on the risk you have identified. Same way, daily, maybe 25 to 50 based on the risk you have identified, and more than 250 based on the respect, like any range in between 25 to 100 based on the risk you have identified in the respective area.
Okay.
Right? So you need to look at both your audit risk, right? What is audit risk? Inherent risk multiplied by control risk plus detection risk. Right? So whatever is your audit risk for the respective area and the frequency, accordingly you'll do the math and identify the respective samples. So factor to determine the extent of test of control. That means how much number of samples you will be testing in the respective controls. What you need to test will be coming to that. Right? First we are at selection, like how many numbers I need to test.
So one example एक पूछना है. मतलब एक hypothetical, जैसे अगर if company has 4 warehouses at different locations and they are doing the inventory check of 1 warehouse per quarter. So every quarter they are checking one warehouse. So will it fall under quarterly or annual?
Yes, yeah, quarterly.
But sir, warehouse तो वो साल में एक बार एक चेक कर रहे हैं एक warehouse को. बस उन्होंने 4.
4.
अच्छा ठीक है, बट चारों वेयर हाउस अगर एक ही साथ टेस्ट हो रहे होंगे तो
then
annual
also it is 4.
अच्छा देन आल्सो क्वार्टरली होगा।
You need
But
to
I guess we'll perform for each of the warehouse if they're performing simultaneously for all the
so then it
warehouses.
would be based on risk and value.
बट सर वेयर हाउस का जब एक बार साल में एक बार वो अगर कर रहे
So
हैं
then, sorry, then it is an annual control. Sorry, my
तो
bad.
वही मैं बोल रहा था, बट इट्स स्प्रेड इनटू 4 लोकेशंस।
Yeah,
And
so then
they
it's an annual control.
हाँ दैट्स व्हाट आई सेड, मतलब क्योंकि वो सिर्फ टाइमिंग वो अपने अकॉर्डिंगली उन्होंने क्वार्टर वाइज किया हुआ है, बट है तो एक ही बार ही टेस्ट कर रहे हैं वो।
So we need to focus on when the activity, like what's the frequency of the activity that is getting performed, rather than how many count, like how many locations or whatever it is. So we need to focus on the activity.
Yes, yeah, absolutely right.
So basically अगर वो क्वार्टरली भी अगर कर रहे हैं बट एक बार कर रहे हैं तो दैट विल कम अंडर एनुअल ओनली।
No, if they are doing 4 location, 1 location each at each quarter, then it's a quarterly control. But if they are doing it once in all the 4 locations, then it's an annual control.
I have a very basic example to it. So basically, inventory count is performed at distribution center and manufacturing sites. And on both the sites, it is performed quarterly. So they're performing 4 times a year.
Yes.
So the control we considered as quarterly. But it's just that there are 2 locations. So we, based on the risk, we might test for both the locations.
Yes.
But we treat them as quarterly control.
Yes.
Okay. That was helpful. Yeah.
Sanchit, make sense?
हाँ जी सर।
Okay. So now second factor in determining the extent of the test of control is the audit period that the auditor is relying on operating effectiveness of control. Whether the audit period is 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, or 15 months, right? Third is relevance and reliability of the audit evidence. How relevant and reliable audit evidence you are obtaining, right? If you are obtaining more reliable or relevant audit evidence at first step, then you might not be doing much like different alternative testing. But at the first, if you're not getting the reliable and relevant audit evidence, then you might be trying to corroborate the evidence from the alternative sources. For example, in the for example, account receivable, right? If you have received the confirmation at first stage from third party, so I think you are not required to do any additional procedure for the existence of account receivable assertion, right? But if you have not received the confirmation, then probably you need to test the invoice, shipment, and customer document, receipt, and acknowledgement, and all those things, right? So if at first stage you are getting more reliable and relevant supporting evidence, then probably your testing number of testing or extent of testing would be less. But if at first stage you are not getting the reliable or relevant audit evidence, then you might need to do more alternative testing procedure. Fourth is other controls related to the relevant assertion. So sometimes there are so many controls around the same assertion, right? You need to look at those controls as well. And if those controls are giving you good comfort, then probably you need to see whether you need to test this control or how much extent you need to involve in testing this control. For example, in purchase and payable process of like occurrence of purchase transaction. So you are testing occurrence of purchase transaction. For that, you are testing issuance of purchase order, you are testing receipt of material, you are also testing invoicing of the material, and you are also testing payment of the material. That means you are testing 4 controls for single assertion, which is called occurrence of purchase transaction. So if the 4 controls are helping you mitigating the same risk, then generally the risk in that particular area is low. And you can test less number of samples compared to individually testing so many samples for the respective assertion, right? Fifth one is extent to which the auditor plan to rely on operating effectiveness of the control in the assessment of risk. If you are plan to rely on the control, then you will be giving more extent of testing of control. But if you're not planning to rely on control, then probably you are not bothered about, right? You might not be testing the control. Make sense? Last one is expected deviation from the control. What is expected deviation? That means when you have planned to test, let's say you are testing sales, and you plan to test, let's say 50 transaction, out of which you have expected maybe 5% can be expected deviation, like 5% can be different than the expected controls, or 5% of them would be like not operating effectively, right? If the expected deviation is more, then sample size is less. If expected deviation is less, then sample size would be more. Make sense?
Yes.
It is like a
similar
tolerable error.
to tolerable error.
Yes, it is like a tolerable error. If tolerable error is more, then sample size is less for test of delay. If tolerable error is less, then sample size is more. So these are certain factors which impact in the extent of test of control, or you can say number of samples to be considered for testing of controls. Note over here is test of control should be performed only on those controls that the auditor determine are suitably designed to prevent or detect the material misstatement relevant in the relevant assertion. So you are not testing controls all. You will be testing only and only the key controls which are relevant to prevent and detect the material misstatement for the relevant assertions. Make sense? This we have discussed many a time. You won't be testing anything which is not material to the financial statement. You'll be testing only those things which are material to the financial statement. So two more topics over here is point in time control or rotational controls. So point in time controls. So generally we test the control over the period of time, right? You have seen like monthly controls. When you are selecting the sample, it should be spread out over the period of 12 months, right? When you are testing like the controls which are more than 250 times in a year. So if you are selecting 25 samples, so you might be selecting 2 samples from each month kind of thing, so that you know like overall monthly how things are moving. But there are certain controls, especially which is annual control, right? There it's a point in time control, not the over the period of time. For example, inventory count, that happen once in a year, right? PP&E count, that is also happen once in a year. Rate setting, do you know what is rate setting? Any idea? Have you heard about this term before, rate setting? Yes, no? Are you guys with me? Any idea what is rate setting?
I don't have the idea, but if you go by the sentence, then setting the rate in a database for to map it with the cost of goods sold, something like that.
Sorry, say that again.
So basically in the SAP, we set a rate for each and every inventory we have in the system. So basically updating that rate list.
Yeah, so rate setting can be your cost setting, or it can be your sales price setting into the system, right? So generally every year like company do revision based on like inflation and other factors that are impacting, or whenever company is launching new product or new services, so there might be rate setting for that, right? That is also generally point in time. You need to test at the time of rate setting.
So selling price basically.
Yeah, maybe selling price, or maybe cost of the inventory. Like every year management do standard costing, like especially in big manufacturing company, every year they do standard costing to calculate the cost of individual product, because if they know the costing, then only they can fix the price, right?
Yes.
So they should know what is the raw material cost, labor cost, overhead cost, right? And then on that cost they will add the markup to reach to the sales price. So those cost calculation they generally do every year. Okay. Right? And then they update in their system about the costing of respective product, and accordingly they will update their sales price by adding the respective margins in those respective product. So that sales team know what is the sales price and the costing team know what is the cost of manufacturing the respective goods and services, right? Those kind of control you need to test at the point when those controls are happening for existence and valuation assertion. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Auditor should plan and test other sufficient tests of control to supplement the operating effectiveness for the period. That means like when you are testing the purchases or when you are testing the cost of goods sold, you'll be testing the, you can say, purchase price from the issue of material, right? You might be testing the sales price on the receipt of material, right? You might be testing the moving average price of the inventory. When you are doing the valuation of inventory, you might be testing whether the company is following FIFO method, LIFO method, weighted average method, right? You might be testing the obsolete provision of the inventory. So when you are looking at inventory valuation perspective, right, you are testing the valuation assertion of the inventory. So you might be testing the prices for the purchase. You might be testing the prices for the moving average goods. You might be testing the prices based on the respective method, FIFO, LIFO, weighted average, and you might be testing the obsolete inventory valuation. So those all controls will club together, help you in getting the right valuation of inventory in addition to the standard costing system. Make sense?
Yes.
Yes, no, difficult to absorb.
Yes,
It's good. So those controls which company perform at the respective points is called point in time controls in simple language, right? Second is rotational testing of control. Have you heard about this term before? Rotational testing of control.
Yes, sir.
What is that?
So usually when nothing changes in operation of the control, or if there is no major change in the environment, we'll just get an understanding and document that, and we can carry forward the same documentation just with a new sample or whatever we're going to do it.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone else would like to add what Kush has shared? Gurmeha, Sanchit, Kashish, Ayush, Ranjita. Okay, so rotational controls are those controls in which there is no change period over period or no change from the last time when you have tested. So for example, in an audit, you have identified, let's say, 100 controls to be tested, which include relating to purchase, sales, expenses, assets, liability, everything, right? Payroll and everything. Out of which there are certain area which is considered as a low risk area. For example, like payroll related or routine expenditure related controls, right? Those controls we have identified as a low risk area, right? And there is no change, like whatsoever the process was there in previous year, same is the process in current year. Whosoever was the responsible control owner person is the same control owner in the current year, right? And the risk of material misstatement is blue. In that case of scenario, if you have tested the control in previous year, you are not required. You can ignore testing in current year. You can just update the documentation and say in the previous year process was this and the current year is also process is same. Previous year control owner is this and the current year also control owner is same. In the overall process, there is no change, and this control is relating to the low risk area, hence we are not testing this again. So this you can do up to 3 years, right? But after 3 years, you mandatorily need to do testing of the same control. That means it will help you bring in more efficiency in your testing of control. Make sense? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So in concluding, the same auditor should consider effectiveness of other element of internal control, including control environment, entity monitoring of control, and the risk assessment, characteristic of control, manual or automated, effectiveness of IT general controls and application control, lack of change in particular control process.
Sir, I think that should have been possess only.
Possess. Yeah, sorry,
Yes.
my bad. Possess. A risk due to change in circumstances and risk of material misstatement and extent of the reliance on the control. So those are things you need to keep in mind when you are planning to consider any control for the rotational control. Generally, IT processing is inherently consistent, right? So for example, like if the system is doing you can say calculation of all sales transaction and giving you the total of the respective sales ledger, generally is same, would not change, right? For example, you have 100 sales transaction and every transaction, let's say, is of 10 value, so overall total would be $10,000, right? So those mathematical kind of controls are generally same, right? And generally other controls also, unless until it is being changed in the system, it's used to be in the same fashion and it's used to be work in a same fashion. So those kind of control can be easily considered in the rotational control, right?
Sir, in point D, right, where we wrote, so this spelling will be POSSESS. POSSESS. Yes, possess.
Cool, thank you. Note here is, more the auditor rely on operating effectiveness of control, greater is the extent of auditor test of control required. If you are relying more, you need to test more. Simple, right? To reduce the extent of substantive procedure, auditor need to be sufficient to determine the operating effectiveness of control. So now we discuss in context of audit.